Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking with Dr. Keith Kaufman. He's a licensed clinical psychologist in the Washington, D.C. and Fairfax, Virginia area, specialized in areas of sports psychology, performance anxiety, and weight loss. And today we're going to be focusing specifically on a book that he co-wrote with two other authors called Mindful Sport Performance Enhancement. How are you doing today, Keith?
I'm good. Thank you, Chris.
So, for people who know, we ended up meeting each other at a conference in Copenhagen that focused on mindfulness in sports psychology. And I found your approach really interesting. And at the time, your book wasn't out, but now it is. And I've been able to look through it a bit and just want to kind of shed a bit of a light on this and allow people to hear what the mindful sport performance enhancement approach is about and how this might be different from other approaches. So the book was kind of the end result of a lot of research and work. So I was wondering if you just tell us a little bit how the book came about.
Yeah, so we've been doing research in mindfulness in sport, and specifically MSPE, Mindful Sport Performance Enhancement, for about a decade now. Kind of started with my dissertation when I was in graduate school and grew from there. And so since I graduated, I've actually been maintained an affiliation with the Catholic University of America, which is where I got my doctorate. And have helped co-supervise a number of graduate students who have come through and continued doing research on MSPE. So the opportunity came along to write this book, and it was sort of putting it all together with sort of a dual hope to, one, kind of let everyone know what we've been doing in one compact place and give people access to our stuff, and two, to spread the word and invite people to use the approach in their own work and their clinical work, their research work, just for personal usage, but we want to get people using MSPE.
Mm-hmm. And so one of the things I found particularly interesting is kind of where it originated from. Kind of picked up on some work that Jon Kabat-Zinn did a long time ago, but kind of faded off because of, I guess, other commitments, other research areas. So can you just tell everyone exactly kind of where you picked it up? It was a rowing intervention that was originally done by Kabat-Zinn and coach, I forget his first name, Beal?
Bruce Bell, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, sure. So when we first got interested, and when I say we, I mean my core research team, and so Dr. Carol Glass, who was my co-author on the book, was my supervisor in graduate school, and we've continued to collaborate and co-supervise together. And one of the folks that we co-supervised was now Dr. Tim Pinot, who was our third author for the book, and so the three of us. So when I talk about our team, that's who I'm talking about. But when Carol Glass and I and a few other folks, when I was in grad school, were putting our heads together and sort of thinking about, well, does mindfulness make sense for performance and sport performance specifically? And started to look at the literature. We found this kind of obscure reference to a poster that Jon Kabat-Zinn had presented at Copenhagen, ironically enough.
Yeah, I found that interesting.
A Copenhagen sports psychology conference. And yeah, exactly what you said. He had used some mindfulness techniques with rowers, used them with both college rowers and Olympic level rowers, and just did this nice little study and found some pretty interesting stuff and made some recommendations about how mindfulness might be applicable in this kind of domain. And then sort of went off and got involved in a lot of other stuff. He's a pretty big name now and has done a lot of work, but never really continued that thread of the sports psychology work. And so we kind of picked that up. We were able to have some conversations with Bruce Bell. As you mentioned, he was the coach who worked with one of those teams that Jon Kabat-Zinn trained. And Bruce was able to actually put us in touch with Jon Kabat-Zinn. We had some correspondences with him. And he was kind enough to retype the poster for us so we could actually see what he did. Because, this was done in like 1985 before there was any electronic record of anything. And so it was literally a poster, and he had to retype it for us and send us his stuff. And so he did that when we were first getting started, and that kind of gave us a foundation on which to expand and eventually develop MSPE.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to let everyone, basically this is coming out of the lineage of mindfulness-based stress reduction. And when people hear about mindfulness, they probably don't necessarily think about sport or sports psychology. For you, why is mindfulness kind of a natural fit to sports psychology or mental training?
Yeah. Well, when you say a natural fit, I think in a lot of ways it's paradigm shifting. And some of what certainly we talk about in our book and with MSPE is very different than how we might traditionally think of sports.
Mhm.
But where it fits really nicely is with ideas of peak performance or optimal performance. I think part of what made room for this is that we don't always do what's best for us in sport. We sort of do what we've been taught or do what the prevailing culture teaches us to do, and to try to approach this a little bit differently was really interesting to us. And part of that too, not to disparage kind of the existing at the time research, but most of it was done on cognitive behavioral approaches in sports psychology, and that still is the vast majority of interventions in sports psych are CBT based. And there were just some questions that were being raised by folks about, well, how effective are these things? Are they as effective as we think? And there was Wegner's famous research and some other studies that spawned from it on the ironic processes of mental control and how maybe this whole idea of, in a nutshell, trying to turn a negative into a positive may not do exactly what we think it's going to do. And
Mhm.
mindfulness is a very different take on that, where at least the way we define it, the Kabat-Zinian kind of mindfulness is more, things are what they are, and how do you work toward awareness and acceptance, as opposed to trying to take something and make it something different.
Mhm. And so one of the things you get into early in the book is something that any sports psychology professionals are really aware of is the mental training paradox, how people are very quick to say that, you know what, the psychological aspect is so important, 90% or whatever, yet at the same point, we don't really make time. And you go through a number of different reasons why we kind of run into this paradox. But a few of it is that it's so new, it's a little bit different. And I love the mindfulness approaches. That's why I was there in Copenhagen. Yet I've personally come into a little bit of difficulty implementing them because we take that existing paradox with kind of the cognitive approach to sports psychology, and then we add meditation, mindfulness, which seems maybe even another step different. How do you feel like this kind of fits together? Why is it not actually as big a deal as people might think?
Why is the paradox not as big a deal, or why is mental
Well,
practice?
sorry, maybe it's more clear. Why do you think that it's worthwhile to be introducing mindfulness, even though it might exacerbate certain issues of the paradox, or maybe, like you said, the paradox isn't quite as big as we make it out to be?
Well, I mean, we kind of coined that idea, the mental training paradox, because I think it actually is a really big thing in sports psychology, as you're saying, that we kind of pay lip service and everyone knows that the mind is important, but when it comes time to systematically train the mind, we just don't do it, or at least don't do it consistently. And we sort of think about it like the mind is like any other part of your body, where you kind of need to train it to see results. And instead, in sports, what we usually do is train the body or train tactics, and just assume that the mind is along for the ride, and we make that distinction. But you're absolutely right, and that's why we made it chapter one of our book. Here we are saying this mental training paradox is a big problem in sports psychology with what exists, which is at least familiar for some folks. But now we're even pushing the envelope further and saying, well, let's try something different, and something that actually requires a pretty big investment of time, of resources. We don't sort of pull any punches in saying that mindfulness, at least in the way we teach it, is not just about pulling it out and using it to perform. It's about a way of life. It's about a way of paying attention going through the world, and certainly using that while we perform or while we're under pressure circumstances. So, we believe, and certainly I believe very strongly, why it's worth that investment is just like anything else. It's hard work to try to change something, and what mindfulness provides is a very real way to make change, and to change the way we relate to achievement, the way we thrive under pressure. And it's very trainable. There's skills that we can use, and skills that we discuss at length in our book, that you can sharpen, that you can strengthen, that you can develop, and it helps you to perform and to relate to achievement differently.
Mm-hmm.
So we think it's really worth it, but it's not. We sort of have a section where we talk about it's not your typical parachuting in kind of intervention where something's wrong, so how am I going to fix it in the short term? It's certainly not something that you can just pull out one day and say, I'm going to try this, and expect that it's going to make a huge difference. That it's something that takes a lot of work and a lot of investment, and you will see we believe, and there's evidence to suggest you'll see change over time. But it is different. It's just a different way to think about things.
And I know one of the things I got most out of that conference, there was all this fantastic information, but afterwards I spoke with Peter Haberl, and I said, you know what, I've tried to do some of these small things, but people look at me funny, and I just feel like it's not working. And he's like, okay, so you're mindful of that, but is it worth it to go through? Do you believe in the approach? And that was a big realization for myself, was that I was turning away from a difficult feeling, because yeah, it was just basically with that my unwillingness to push through was because people were looking at me maybe a little bit strange. They weren't sure what I was doing. I wasn't exactly sure in kind of as a result of that. And so where I thought kind of the issue may have been with other people, realized that no, it was that I wasn't comfortable with it. So it's one of these things that's really a different way of doing things, but there's a lot of people out there, including yourself and myself, that really believe this is the direction forward. So when you talk about
Can I say something about your point real quick, Chris, because I think it's a great point. And I think it functions on a lot of levels, because you're talking about having mindfulness of yourself and recognizing your own discomfort and how maybe the instinct is to go the opposite way. And that's, I think, that, you talk about what happens in sport performance. That's a wonderful illustration of kind of our default response and how bringing some awareness can enable us to make a different choice. I think it also speaks to the reality that this is so different, and it is hard. And sometimes you say some of the stuff and people do look at you funny because it's different. And sports, and I love sports. I work in sports. I don't say this to be critical of sports, but notoriously sports are a very closed off world. And the idea is that we do what we know. And when you come in saying something different, sports can be a particularly hard realm to break into, to get people to be open-minded, to be able to take that risk. So what I would say in what you just observed in yourself, which is such a great point, is that comes from somewhere, right? That feeling comes from a realistic situation. But being mindful of that reality also frees you up as an individual to make a choice, right? Do I want to fade away from this, back away from this, or do I want to approach this and try to do something differently?
Yeah, and right now I'm trying to figure out the timing, but when I commit to going through, and I'm probably going to go use the MSP function, because I'm someone who would try to make it perfect on their own, but having a template here, 6 weeks, you know what, let's run that and I can adjust as we go. But when I commit to doing that, I'm going to know that I'm going to feel a little bit uncomfortable. I'll be able to kind of accept that, stay with it, and hopefully move past it, right? So being aware of that will help me perform in the future, when there's going to be part of me like, oh my God, why am I doing this again? People are looking at me strange, all sorts of things like that. So it is a really interesting thing. And it kind of just shows that the practitioners, we can start to rely on certain things that work and not want to go in another direction. And someone who cognitively thinks that this is the way to go, there was kind of a discomfort or emotional piece that was holding me back a little bit. So I just want to go, when you say that there's mechanisms we can train and it can help with the kind of peak performance, what is it that is improving when we actually sit down and go through, well, not only sitting down, we sit down, move, and go through this program?
Right. Well, there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. And so I'll try to sort of organize my thought and try to be concise. That in general, and again, this comes from a Kabat-Zonian kind of tradition, but the way we constructed MSPE was to train two broad mindfulness skills, which is awareness and acceptance. With awareness being, a recognition of what's happening. So what you just described in yourself, the recognition of your discomfort, right? That's a great example of awareness. And so once we become aware of something, what do we do with it, right? As we just got done saying, a lot of times we get aware of something uncomfortable or something unknown, and our instinct is to push it away, is to reject, is to change it. And what we've seen and what other research has shown is that can compound issues, that can make things harder from a performance perspective. So another alternative is to practice what's called acceptance, which is not resignation, which sometimes it's confused with, like just giving up or, oh, well, this is what it is. That's not what we mean by acceptance. What we mean is acknowledging that the situation is what it is, And once I can let that in, whether it's good, bad, right, wrong, and sort of separate myself from the judgment of what is, just kind of see it as objectively as possible, it provides choice in terms of, okay, how do I want to handle this? Right. And a great example of that is like in sports, we experience discomfort all the time. We experience mental discomfort. We experience physical discomfort from taxing our bodies. And, running is a great example. If you're running and you're getting tired or you're experiencing pain, not acknowledging that, trying to bury that or ignore that, it really kind of puts you at the mercy of it, at least from a mindfulness perspective. And what we'd say is, okay, if you become aware of pain, what you can do is recognize it, acknowledge it as what's happening, and then making a choice. Do I want to focus exclusively on my pain, or are there other places that I can put my attention that would be more adaptive? For what I'm trying to do. So you're not denying it. You're not trying to change it or lie to yourself about it. You're acknowledging it, but then you're making a choice that I can direct my attention to other parts of my present experience and have that be a piece of it rather than the whole thing. And it's amazing. And John Kabat-Zinn really made his mark with MBSR initially in pain management. For exactly that. It's people who had chronic pain were turning to mindfulness because mindfulness wasn't going to cure or take away the pain. It was going to change their relationship to the pain. And that was what was so powerful and incredible about it. So we teach, these fundamental skills of awareness and acceptance. And what that promotes in an athlete is the ability to self-regulate psychologically. And what that means is the ability to not necessarily change, but the ability to work with how they're thinking and feeling, which is an incredibly, incredibly powerful tool to have in your arsenal, right? So being aware of something, accepting it, being a route toward ultimately facilitating an optimal mindset in sport. That's really what we're after.
Mm-hmm. And so one of the things is it starts with acceptance and awareness, but it does lead to an ability to self-regulate. And specifically within the model, we had it going towards attentional regulation and emotional regulation. And so once they're able to kind of regulate those two things, what does that allow them to do? How does that lead to peak performance for them?
Well, one sort of proposal that we make, something that we tie it to, and I know you and I have talked about this some, is there some suggestion or a viable hypothesis that if you can self-regulate in certain ways, it can get you into what's known as a peak performance state or an optimal performance state. That, we've studied this enough to know that certain factors tend to accompany peak performance. And so if you're able to be aware of where you're at, and work with that to a degree that you can help yourself. For example, we know that being present focused, focusing all of your attention on, or as much of your attention as possible on what you're doing while you're doing it, generally facilitates your performance on task. And that's exactly the style of attention that mindfulness is strengthening. And so if you notice that, for example, you're getting worried about something and wondering, is something going to work out? Is someone going to judge you negatively for it? Which, these are common thoughts that athletes have. We can identify, well, those are almost always about the future. Or sometimes we'll have a thought about the past, something that we already did, and then we'll spring forward into the future. And I sort of call that like mental ping pong, where you're jumping over the net, which is the present, right? And so if you can kind of focus your attention consciously, intentionally on the present moment, then that's a really adaptive mental skill to have to potentially promote peak performance.
Mm-hmm.
And even we can debate the semantics on this, because some people talk about peak performance, some people talk about optimal performance. And with mindfulness, you can even kind of, get really into the weeds and talk about optimal experience and how, when you're really plugged into something, when you're really experiencing something with all of your attention, how that tends to promote much more of a sense of satisfaction, a sense of joy, a sense of completeness in what we're doing, which is kind of a rarity in our modern society of multitasking and divided attention. And so, I mean, not to go too far off, but it just even that thought makes me realize, I mean, what we spend most of our time doing is dividing our attention. That's how we live our lives. And then all of a sudden we get on the field and we expect it's supposed to be different. But if we've trained our minds to be divided and unfocused and multitasking and all over the place and not managed, then, why would it be any different in a performance situation when we kind of really need our attention? And so this is a way to be able to harness that and put the power of your attention behind what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say one more thing real quick, that you mentioned Peter Haberl, who works out with the United States Olympics Committee. And one of his kind of well-known quotes, which I absolutely love, I tell people all the time, it's that attention is the currency of performance, right? The idea that, this precious commodity that we have, that when we can spend it wisely while we're performing, that goes a huge long way toward helping us perform at our best, or at least reach our potential.
Yeah, it's one of these ones is if your attention is in the present moment, you've won half the battle there. And one of the things that's always interesting when I first start working with athletes and ask them to start paying attention where their attention is, they recognize that, oh my, I'm barely there. And what then happens is they can become judgmental about the fact that, okay, I'm going to past or the future. And I tell them a little bit, but I do want them to go through that process where they see what it's like when they're kind of missing the goal, right? And then the next step is to bring about this acceptance that, you know what, this is what a mind does. It plays ping pong, it goes over. And it's not a terrible thing, but we need to be able to bring it back. And by kind of decreasing that, the emotional judgment that happens there, we're able to get back to that present sooner, right? I know when I first was learning this stuff, well, even pre-mindfulness, when I was just learning the sports psychology, I was playing in some men's league basketball, and I was like, okay, I know all this stuff, I'm going to do it well. And then I was like, I'm not using my focus cues. Why aren't I using my focus cue? I really should be able to do this. I'm going to be teaching people about this. Why aren't I doing it? And I just got further and further from the present. So it's one of these ones that you tell someone to be in the present moment. It sounds like it's a fortune cookie thing or anything like that, but it's a very simple concept, very difficult to execute. And just with almost all of the mindfulness approaches, there is this emphasis on present moment attention. And to get people to practice and train that, it makes such a big difference.
I think you can also frame it in a way, like you're right, it sounds a little bit out there sometimes, or a little bit, why meditation sometimes gets a bad rap. People just think, oh, it just sounds so frilly, oh, present moment attention. But it's also just common sense, right? Like when we're focused on what we're doing while we're doing it, we do better at it. And when you think about how many distractions could possibly exist in a sports environment, both internally and externally, that's an amazing skill, because so often we're going through and we're doing things and we're not paying attention to what we're doing while we're doing it. And it tends to detract from our experience, and also we don't do as well, especially when what we're focused on is something like anxiety and threats. And I think what you also said is really important and really valuable to highlight for a moment, that part of what I personally really took to mindfulness when I was first introduced to it is this is one of the few things that I've ever encountered, at least in the realm of academics, that has there's no right or wrong. There's no good or bad. It's not about doing something perfectly. As you said, the nature of the mind is to jump, is to wander. And what we're talking about is not perfection, is not about preventing yourself from ever getting distracted. We're talking about becoming aware, exactly what you said, thinking about thinking, where focusing on how I'm focusing. And when I'm focusing in a way that is harmful to me, or makes me feel lousy, I have a choice. I can focus differently if I choose. And that's where the power comes in. We really try to highlight that. The power comes in choice. And we have, I think, kind of a culture, a society of achievement in sports and in other domains where we think in terms of right, wrong, good, bad. You even used the magic word, Chris. You said should. And I tell people all the time, should is my least favorite word in the English language. It always implies some kind of conditionality, some kind of not good enough, right? I'm doing this, but I should be doing that. Like nothing good ever comes from saying should.
So I think that gives a good introduction to how this can make a difference in performance. If we want to talk a little bit about the program itself, I know if you're developing something, pretty much everything comes about for certain reasons. So I was just wondering if you can talk a little bit about decisions that went into the structure of the program, the fact that the number of sessions, how long to do it for, how the individual sessions are kind of structured themselves.
So, I mean, along the same lines of what I was just saying too, like there's this tension when you develop a protocol like this, because, you know, when we read a book or when we read a protocol, the thought is, okay, I do step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, and that's not really how we mean it. We sort of develop the program to be fluid, to be adaptable. We give suggestions, we give guidelines on what we recommend, but you know, something we're excited about, and we've already seen this starting to happen with some folks who have reached out to us, is to take the MSPE program and to make it their own, is to shift things around, to extend or to make the sessions more concise, and to really kind of make it suit their purposes. You know, of course, now in doing that, we also did try to manualize it and try to provide a protocol that people can replicate. So it is a tension. When we were first developing it, we really, as you mentioned, were influenced by mindfulness-based stress reduction and also mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which is used for depression, and is an outgrowth itself of mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR. And so as we talk about in the book, we use some of the same core exercises, things like a sitting meditation kind of practice, an eating meditation kind of practice, a body scan. And what really distinguishes MSPE is that we wanted to include more and more movement into the formal practice, and into the education and the informal practice, increasing amounts of applicability to sport specific situations. So we want people to learn mindfulness fundamentals, but then we want them to be able to apply them to their real life and to their real world performance situations. And that's kind of where we see MSPE as a step forward in terms of what makes it unique.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, one of the things, even when you're presenting in Copenhagen, that struck me, it was mindfulness off the cushion. So yes, we're starting with all the basics, but then you're moving it forward a little bit more. I know a lot of different programs will use the mindful walking, which is part of this, but then moving kind of to the mindful yoga, and then finally developing the sport specific meditation. It just, to me, had that progression. So people would see, okay, it's not just training my mind outside of sport. We're making the links fairly explicit, and it's got a nice little progression of, you know, sit, walk, run type thing.
Right. So the formal practice, exactly what you said, it's designed to be a progression toward ultimately having a bridge to actual sport performance, so that people, you know, learn what this mindful style of attention is, and practice that mindful style of attention, and then ultimately how to perform while in this mindful frame of mind. And also throughout, we try to make so we kind of look at MSPE as having a practice component, like what we're talking about, but it also has a very big education component that we realize this is new, this is different for many folks who would be doing this training. So providing education on what mindfulness is and why it's relevant to sports. So we really try to hammer in a rationale and build on that rationale throughout the training. As you were mentioning earlier, you know, this can be a tough sell. This can be a very different way of looking at things to a culture that doesn't necessarily always take to that so easily. And so, you know, part of what we build into the program is really trying to educate and make it clear why this is worthwhile, and why it's worth the investment. And another piece, we have designed MSPE to be a group-based intervention. So to be done like with a team, or with you can do it with an eclectic group of athletes, and it's fully customizable to any sport or any performance activity. So we've even done studies with mixed group of athletes, so people from across different sports. I sort of lost my thread here for a second. So it's usually done in a discussion, in a group sort of format, and so a big piece of that too is having group discussion and having athletes and coaches learn from each other as they engage this new way to perform. And we've seen some of the biggest steps forward in terms of people really getting this and really making this a part of what they do through those kinds of discussions. So you can certainly do this individually too, with an individual coach or counselor or whomever, or do it on your own. That's part of why we wrote the book, so people can take themselves through the program. But in terms of how we designed it, we did it with these three main components in mind: the practice piece, the education piece, and the discussion piece.
Mm-hmm. And that was one thing I really wanted to highlight is it's fairly modular, so people can change how they want to do it. Maybe they're only introducing one exercise at a time, but you don't want to lose the part where you're discussing with the athletes how this actually connects to their sport. Because not just from you, from a lot of other people I've heard, that's when they start to buy in. The exercises are always interesting, but it's that discussion where they're like, oh, there is some use to it. And if you're in a group, one person might not get it, but if someone else says, okay, I can do it like this, and they're like, oh, maybe that would work. So that's one thing I just wanted to emphasize there. So one of the things that is unique about it is the sport meditation that kind of is developed in the fifth session. Can you just talk a little bit about that, either how that came to be or what one might look like?
Yeah. So that's, I think that's the newest part. I think in some ways, and certainly like, if you remember what happened in Copenhagen, we had a very rich discussion about this. I think it's different enough that some people, like, it can even rub the wrong way. But I think the spirit of the sport meditation is, as I said, to fully bring a mindful style of attention into the activity itself. And so throughout MSPE, we talk about having different what are called present moment anchors for your attention. So you might start with a more sedentary, typical foundational mindfulness practice like the breath. And in that type of meditation, the breath is the anchor for attention. In something like the body scan, which is another very common sort of core fundamental mindfulness practice, the anchor for attention are different body sensations that you might detect as you bring your attention to different body regions sequentially. And so, as we said, we're sort of moving in the direction of more and more movement throughout MSPE, and that all culminates in the sport meditation where we work with the group or the team that we're with. Let's say it's a basketball team, and we'll say, okay, we want to do a meditation. We want to do an exercise that's actually about basketball. And the anchor for our attention for this kind of meditation is actually the sensations that are generated by engaging in this activity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about becoming aware, again, of what you're doing while you're doing it. Now, sometimes people hear that and they think, well, the last thing I want to be doing is thinking while I'm playing. And there's a pretty robust body of research out there that talks about, look, once you get good at a sport, once you're beyond the beginning phase and, skills have become relatively automatized or automatic, you want to just sort of let them flow out of you. You don't want to be thinking about what you're doing while you're doing it. And that's agreed. Actually, what we're after with the sport meditation is mental efficiency, not mental inefficiency. And so when you bring a mindful style of attention to a sport activity, it's not about telling yourself how to run if you already know how to run. It's not about telling yourself how to shoot a basketball if you already know how to shoot a basketball. It's about engaging what we call your observing mind. In other words, that you are with yourself while you're doing something. You're not telling yourself how to do it. You're not judging yourself on how to do it. You're simply observing yourself while you're engaging in these activities. And if you think about it, when you're in the zone, or when you're in flow, and sometimes those things are equated to each other, that's exactly the style of attention we have, where we're totally absorbed in what we're doing, and our attention is so focused, it's so totally and completely on what we're doing, that it almost feels automatic. It almost feels completely effortless. And that's because there's this amazing mental efficiency state that gets achieved. And that's exactly what we're after by doing the sport meditation. So we develop these movement-based anchors for the activity of focus and work with our participants on sort of nurturing this observing mind while they're participating. So, it's not meditation while you're trying to compete. It's not, it's not trying to interfere with a skill that's already really well learned. It's a very different way of being present focused.
Yeah, I think that was where some of the confusion was. They were, for whatever reason, they were thinking it as kind of a performance skill rather than a training exercise, right? So this is, again, one of those things that will help them develop an awareness of their body in motion. So at least that's the way I interpreted it. So
right.
And
right, exactly. Because sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, one of the things you're talking about is just it is kind of a peak performance versus a autopilot. There is an awareness. Whereas when we're on autopilot, like, if you're driving your car, and I actually did this yesterday, I got off at the wrong exit where I used to live. I was thinking about something different. Whereas the times that I've been in kind of a peak performance zone, it's hard to know what I was thinking about, but I was aware of what was happening. It was just more like there was wind at my back or something was kind of pushing me forward. So that's been at least my experience.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting at is such a crucial distinction, and one that we often don't make. But it's a really important one in using mindfulness in this way. So we think about autopilot, right? And a lot of people like think they want to be on autopilot while they're playing. Like I don't want, people come to my office all the time and say, I overthink things. I don't want to think. And I think we did this exercise in Copenhagen. Maybe it was Peter who led it. It's like, okay, take 10 seconds and try not to think, right? And that's impossible. It's funny to watch someone try, but it's totally and completely impossible. And when you're on autopilot, basically your mind is free to go wherever it's going to go. And in a performance situation, unfortunately, oftentimes it doesn't go to places that are all that helpful. And so when you're totally focused on something, when you're actually using, if there is such a thing as perfect attention, I'm not crazy about that phrasing, but just to go for effect and clarity here, like if you're totally and completely focused on what you're doing while you're doing it, that actually can promote this feeling of effortlessness, this feeling of automaticity, which is very different than automatic pilot. But oftentimes that distinction is lost. So I think what you're saying is really important, and it's the latter that we're after in MSPE. It's helping someone to be so absorbed and so engaged in what they're doing while they're doing it that it actually feels effortless and automatic, even though it's not automatic, in terms of attention, right? That it's not tuning out. It's being so tuned in that it becomes this sort of ideal way.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that it said in the book, and that people could pick up the book and even go through this on their own. And I was just looking through the protocol. It's very detailed. I'd say that'd just be a little bit suboptimal because there is usually a lot that you learn from other people in groups. But if there was an individual who wanted to look into mindfulness for performance, or a coach that was interested in bringing something like this to their players, their athletes, where would they start? Do you think do they want to look for a general mindfulness based thing? Do you think if they picked up the book and were just ready to put themselves out there, that they could go like that? What do you think would be a good approach for people who are interested but not exactly sure where to start?
Yeah. Well, that, really the intention of our book was to be readable and accessible to anybody, people who are sports psychologists or people who are, experienced with mindfulness, or folks that don't have any experience with either, that might just be interested in the topic or might be athletes or coaches. So certainly I would hope if someone's interested that our book would be a useful resource for them. But I think your point is well taken. Absolutely. That best practice for MSPE, we strongly recommend doing it in a group because that discussion piece is so important. But certainly you could do it on your own, or you could do it in an individual level. That is possible, and can still be quite successful. But I think we want it to be accessible. We want it to be open. I would recommend if somebody were to want to lead MSPE training, for example, that they have some experience with mindfulness, that they have some experience leading groups, that they have experience working with athletes and know what athlete culture is about and like. So basically to have competence before they would go out and try to do something like this. It's certainly not psychotherapy. It's not something you would need a license or a certification to be able to do, but nonetheless to be effective and best practice, you want to be competent. But in terms of learning about mindfulness and its applications to sport and why it might be useful, and we mean MSPE to be a very beginner level introduction kind of training. So hopefully the book itself would be helpful to someone who was just interested in the topic.
One of the things that it's interesting, I've done some teacher training. Like I said, I've stumbled a bit when trying to put together a full program. A lot of what you need to be able to do isn't necessarily about the content, right? You wouldn't have to be a sports psychology expert to go through this content, but you want to be able to have a process where go through the exercise and then facilitate people's reflections and just be able to ask what's happening. There's one anecdote in the book that I found particularly interesting. One of your co-authors, Tim, was leading a group and one of the athletes got a little bit agitated. So instead of kind of engaging with the content had the wherewithal to kind of say, okay, well, you were comfortable in the other sessions, and I just feel like something's a little bit different. What's happening within you? And just bringing it back to their experience, because a huge part of the mindfulness is about just getting in touch with your experience. And when people pay attention, they notice things and they can figure out what works for them. So definitely it helps if you have any of this background, but if you're willing to put yourself out there, and you don't necessarily have to be an expert. I found with different groups working with sports I don't know, that if you just say that, hey, I don't know, and if I'm getting things wrong, let me know, people can feel all right. You wouldn't want to do this with a hostile group, but if you have a bunch of people who are volunteered that say, okay, I want to be here anyways, then it probably wouldn't be quite as difficult. Just I know
Can I say
we're
one thing real quick about that, just real quick. I think you're right, and we do have experience in one of the studies we did, which we actually talk about in the book too. We were with what we'd consider to be a hostile group, and there's always a tension here too when you're working with athletes or teams between, if a coach signs a team up for something and now we're asking for a big commitment. So I think in a best case scenario, someone would come to this because they want to, because they're intrinsically motivated to learn about this and they want to try something different. I wouldn't say the hostile crowd is the typical one, but I think it is something to be aware of. Is, are people doing this because they're being told to, or being pressured to, or because they really want to?
Mm-hmm. I know we're coming up just about the time limit. So do you have anything we didn't cover that you want to mention? Any final thoughts?
No, I mean, I think you hit most of the big things. I think one part of our book too that we were really excited about, that if anyone's interested in, we do present 2 case studies, one of a coach and one of an athlete who went through the program, and you can kind of see what that's like through their eyes, and that was really fun for us to write and to go through that with them. And I think you can really see that, when it comes to this stuff, there is no right or wrong. There is no sort of good, bad, that this is the way it has to be, which I just love so much about mindfulness and MSPE. It's something I'm so proud of, is to try to get away from that dichotomous, judgmental way that we tend to function, that in so many cases makes us so stressed.
Mm-hmm.
This is just such a different way of operating, and so that's just such a big piece of why we got into this and why we think it's so effective. The other thing is, I would just invite anyone listening to this. We do have a website that we operate, an MSPE website, and on there we have a listing of all the research that we've done and about our team, and talk about what MSPE is. And we also have some free resources, including recordings of all the different MSPE exercises. So again, there's not one way to do every exercise, but samples, or at least professionally done versions that we've created, are available on that website. And the URL is mindfulsportperformance.org. So if anyone wants to come check that out, that's a really good sort of supplementary resource, or even an introductory one if you're not quite ready to buy the book or something like that. That's a good thing to check out.
Perfect. I was just going to shout out that website. The other thing that I noticed after I ordered the book, there's a DVD. And so what's different or maybe enhanced about the DVD than the book?
Yeah, so the DVD was, I guess you could call it sort of an instructional or an introductory video that I shot with some college athletes, with some golfers, and kind of introducing them, doing some demonstrations of some of the MSPE exercises, and then some dialogues about what it is, covering some of the same stuff that we've talked about in this conversation, Chris, but some other things too. So the DVD is a great supplementary resource for the book, but the book really outlays the whole program. That's not really what the DVD is. It's meant to be more of a demonstration.
Okay. So would that be of more interest maybe, because I know the book, there is a depth of research to it that I found just amazing. In addition to the case studies, the whole protocol. If someone was interested more in doing the protocol, does that supplement, would that work on its own, or really you still want the book?
I think the book is for anyone who wants to go through the program themselves or potentially lead the program. I think the book is really the best resource. I think the DVD is certainly helpful Especially I think if you want to lead it, to just kind of see what it can look like before going out and doing it on your own.
Hmm.
And certainly if you're interested in being a participant, you can kind of see what it looks like too. But I would say the DVD is meant for more of kind of sort of a leader slash academic kind of audience, as opposed to just your casual athlete who might pick it up and say, hey, I want to learn more about this. I think the book is really the best resource for that.
Okay, it's great. Thank you very much for speaking to me today, Keith. Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, thanks, Chris. This is great.
Cheers.